How do you govern a mostly Democratic state as a Republican governor? How do you then add infrastructure, internet and otherwise, to the rural parts of your state and increase your housing supply while keeping your taxes low? How do you do all that while becoming the most popular governor in the United States? I'm thrilled we've been able to ask these questions to the man himself, former governor of Massachusetts, current president of the NCAA, Charlie Baker. Let's listen here on Maine for Keeps. I remember the picture of your kids on your desk and one of those cubicle-y desks, you know, with the felt shit on top and the L shape. And I was coming into your office. You were the CEO of Harvard Vanguard at a tough time, the biggest medical group in Massachusetts? And it was at a tough time. Do you remember that?
I do. I think Harvard Vanguard was at the time probably the largest non-hospital affiliated medical group, right? And it was at that point in time part of Harvard Pilgrim Healthcare, and Harvard Pilgrim Healthcare at that point was sort of on a very downward slide that eventually, turned into receivership. But the funny thing about it was I took the job because I was a huge fan of that medical practice. I mean, I'd been part of it as a patient. I'd worked with those folks when I served as Secretary of Health and Human Services and Secretary of Administration and Finance under Governors Weld and Cellucci. And I just really thought it would be a great place to go to work. And what I don't think I anticipated was the financial challenges that Harvard Pilgrim, both nonprofits, by the way, but Harvard Pilgrim was the sort of parent company. It was the insurance entity, and it got into a ton of trouble financially. And I kind of got drafted to go from running the medical group to running the health plan, because if the health plan had failed, the medical group would have been,
the stem cell was giving out, the organism was going to die. I remember being very dismayed to find out how much of your revenues was capitated from the plan, because I wanted to do your fee-for-service billing. I'm like, wait a minute, where am I going to get my hook in here? So that was too bad. But
that is one heck of a memory you got there, John. Because you're right. That was, at that point in time, it was probably 85, oh God, maybe even 90% capitated.
Yeah, it was. So, if that one quote customer went away, that's game over. And then so that led you to the turnaround. And this was like you say, it's a nonprofit. It was pretty entangled with the state. Did the time of, and you, heroic turnaround, by the way, mazel tov on that. Did that where you started looking at you had been kind of the CFO of the state at a very ripe age. I mean, what, was it 20s even, or early 30s?
30s. Yeah, 30s.
That makes you very old. Sorry to see that.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Mel. Yeah.
You're welcome. Where do you start to look at the state and go, geez, there are problems I'd like to fix?
I was at Harvard Pilgrim. By the way, I went to Harvard Pilgrim in the fall or the spring of 99. So halfway through what was, for all intents and purposes, a fiscal year in which Harvard Pilgrim lost $225 million and went into receivership. And so we had that 6-month window to fix a whole bunch of things, because if we didn't fix and change this trajectory to something that looked like that, it was probably going to go away. And that would have been a problem for the medical group too. And by the way, a huge problem for all the hospitals that the health plan owed money to. But we did manage to get enough done in that last 6 months so that after losing 225 in 99, we lost 10 in 2000, and we're basically break even or better the second half of that year. And we still have a lot of work to do to build our public credibility back and chase some of the membership that we lost because of all the trouble we had. But we had a really good team. And, for the last 6 years I was there, it was the number 1 ranked health plan in America for customer service and member satisfaction. So I feel very good about the team. I feel very good about the work. And obviously, I feel really good about the fact that the medical group was able to, sort of survive all that and go off and become Atrius, which is now an independent freestanding physician practice in um, big chunks of Massachusetts, which is great.
And people don't really appreciate, I don't think, unless you're a deep healthcare buff, the importance of an independent freestanding practice as opposed to a hospital owned practice, right? Where the independent freestanding has a little bit less of a obligation to send shit to the hospital and a little more flexibility. In fact, even incentive to do it more cheaply outside of the hospital.
I do think there's a certain benefit that comes with being sort of in control of what I would describe as your world. You still need really strong partners on the hospital side, but I think it does create a certain amount of independence and flexibility. That's harder. It's just harder to have that if you work inside the construct of a hospital system. It kind of makes sense. If the hospital system has to figure out how to organize itself in a way that benefits the hospital system, whereas a freestanding medical group can start with, let's figure out how we need to be organized, and then we'll figure out what the relationship we need to have that makes the most sense with the hospitals that we provide services with.
It's sort of an extra layer of shopper energy where this medical group is saying which hospital is behaving best, which hospital turns around best, and so you're not sucked into one Borg or another necessarily.
That's a good way of thinking about it. I also, there's also a tremendous, this better than anybody, there's a tremendous amount of culture associated with all that stuff too. And I would never underestimate the role of culture relative to structure and strategy. The culture, an independent practice has a slightly different culture. And I think and some people are comfortable in one, some people are comfortable in the other. But I look, the the Atrius practice group is still the practice group for the Baker family, believe it or not. I mean, I've been a patient there for more than 40 years.
Well, of course, I am a loyal Firefly patient for reasons that shall not go described in this neutral, non-profit, non-denominational podcast. But Firefly Health is also worth looking at for anybody who's watching. Anyway, talk to us about, so you've had now a legit, you've been a civil servant. I mean, you worked directly for a governor, 2 governors. You've done a business turnaround, albeit sort of close to the state, because the state would be holding a lot of a bag if those things collapse together. Now you're looking forward. What gets you up in the morning about Massachusetts? What do you want to change before you're governor? Looking in sort of from the outside. This is now the Deval-Patrick administration, which you're definitely not part of. What makes you say, I want to be governor because I want to change what?
I think the 3 things I was most interested in, number 1 was doing something about our housing challenges, which ironically are, we made some progress on, not enough, and continues to be, I think, the single biggest challenge that many of us in the Northeast face. If it costs, $800,000 or $900,000 to buy a home, when you can buy the same home in all kinds of places in other parts of the country for half that, or for $500,000, you lose a lot of your next generation. If you look at where people have left Massachusetts over the course of the past few years, they've basically been the most people have been between the ages of 25 and 35, which is obviously the group that's out there looking to buy a home for the first time. So that was number 1, what to do about the housing piece. Number 2 was to dramatically improve the Commonwealth's relationship with cities and towns. We have 351 cities and towns. I'd served as a local official. My running mate that year served as a local official. And I'm a big believer that if the cities and towns in the state are working in a very collaborative and open and trusting way, you can do a lot of really great things. And the third was to do everything we could to lower other costs of living, business, the works. And Because in the Northeast, especially, Midwest has some of this problem too. Um, the cost of everything is an enormous problem. If you don't feel like you live in a great community, and you don't feel like you live in a community where the schools are good, and the streets are safe, and there's parks and playgrounds for your kids to play in, and you can find a house you can afford. If you can't find that, there are plenty of other places in America where you can.
You had housing, and Maine's got that in spades. We had a 50% increase in the cost per square foot of housing between 20 in the last really in 3 of the last 5 years, and then it's sort of planing out now, but way too high. Cities and towns, what looks different in your mind? What did you want to change? And we had Mayor Koch from Quincy on, who's a big fan of yours. So there was something worked with a town that I love, a city that I love. But what were you shooting for there? What was going to change?
I wanted to have a strategy that basically gave cities and towns what I would describe as a menu of options to choose from with respect to what things they needed to do to most significantly enhance their greatest opportunities for success. And so in Western Mass, for example, we basically drove a project to provide broadband to 53 communities in Western Mass that didn't have it. Now, think about the fact that we had basically this was really hard to do from an organizational and an administrative point of view, and it was expensive. But thankfully, the legislature bought in on helping us finance the money that was required to put the infrastructure in. I mean, we literally, John, have towns in Western Mass where we put in more telephone poles than they had people. Okay, but you can't be a vibrant community anymore if you don't have high-speed internet service.
People are saying that the internet is going to be big.
It's going to be big, yeah.
Yeah,
you're right. Yeah.
Here in Maine, we lovingly look over at Alaska, who does have worse infrastructure than we do, but everybody else is ahead of us. So we definitely feel that. So a lot of this
you have a lot of rural territory too. I mean, I'm telling you, I don't know what the distribution is in Maine on this stuff, but those 53 communities, you go talk to people in those communities, and it was literally like, no business will come here. No one can sell a house. We haven't had a new kindergartner in our school in 10 years. We are just sitting here waiting to basically go away, and that one project in those 53 communities changed everything. And so that was like one of the goals was do something about the way. We also changed the way we financed a lot of our local funding, our state funding for local roads in rural communities, right? Created almost everything we did that was state grant programs. We had traditional funding, and then we had rural community funding, because if you organize this stuff around if you call it like the 200 communities that are sort of what I would call traditional communities, and then the 150 communities that are rural communities, most people historically organized all the state grant programs around the traditional communities, and the rural ones kind of always got left out.
Did you run into towns that said, we're NIMBYs, we don't want to cooperate, but just give us our money? And how did you handle kind of, what's the right word, local power versus state plans?
The lieutenant governor and I, Karen Polito, we're both former local officials. And the guy we put in to run housing and economic development was the former city manager of Chelsea. And he had done a ton of downtown and housing development in Chelsea, which is part of what made him interesting to us. But I think, from my point of view, the goal there was to create as much opportunity for people to find whatever it was they were looking for inside our state and federal programming. And the other example I can give you is we took, most of those programs are separate, right? There's one for housing, there's one for downtowns, there's one for local roads, there's one for this, there's one for that. And they all historically got bid separately. So what we did is we said, okay, let's turn this into a package, okay, and let people bid on the package. And so, if you needed a little bit of help with this and a little bit of help with that and a little bit of help with this to make a neighborhood or a downtown or an outlying area better, you could bid on all of those things at the same time.
When you say bid, you mean essentially grant request? Go to the state
Yeah.
and say, look, we're gonna build you taxpayers, we're gonna build you earnings, but we're gonna need some money to sort of prime the pump here.
Correct. And most of this involved what was either state money appropriated by the legislature or federal money that came to us through federal programming, but needed to
How
go
much
through
of Massachusetts' total budget was federal dollars versus state taxes?
Well, if you're talking capital, most of the capital money was state money. About half the operating budget is probably federal. I mean, keep in mind, like, Medicaid is a 50-50 program, and it's an enormous part of the state budget. But there's also, you also have, you have transportation money in there, you have child welfare money, you have education money, there's one of the most interesting things about, having worked in state government in the 90s in those two cabinet positions and then coming back in 2015 was how much more influence the federal government had over state government when I came back than it did when I left. Tons of enhanced influence in education, energy, public safety, areas that used to be sort of thought of as primarily state, local jurisdictions, now had kind of an overlay of
tons of money and tons of strings attached.
Yes, a lot of federal influence there.
How much of your time as governor did you spend resetting the strings with the feds? Was that a thing governors do, is say, hey man, don't make me do it that way, but can I do it this way instead? Almost, can you block grant me? Was that a big part of your life, particularly in housing?
What I would say about that is that people used to ask me all the time what my relationship was with the president, whoever the president was. And I used to say to them that, my relationship mostly was with the cabinet secretaries, because the cabinet secretaries, for all intents and purposes, were often the subject matter experts and also the folks who ran the processes that ultimately led to the grant making and the reimbursements and all the rest. And so my job, I thought, was to get to know them and to find out how what we wanted to do fit with what they wanted to do.
Were you able to get sort of strings removed in areas related to housing?
Well, most of the strings related to housing in Massachusetts are state and local. Yeah. I'll give you
30% set aside, kind of the housing authority thing.
Well, more like in Massachusetts, we had a state law that we got changed that you needed 2/3 votes out of the local governing body for any housing project to move forward. 2/3. So if you think about a community that has a select board with 3 people on it, you need all 3 of them. If that select board has 5 people on it, you need 4 of them. If it has 11 people on it, you need 9 of them. Or 8 of them. So there would be these articles written all the time in which people would say, housing project, housing redevelopment, housing this, lost at the local level 5-4. But the vote was actually 5-4 and 5-4 against. And so it took me almost 3 years to change that law to get it to the point where you could do housing and get it approved at a majority rule. But that all by itself, honestly, was an incredible impediment. Let's just leave it at that.
Were you able to use the power of the purse there and say, listen, towns that play ball, we had Governor LePage, I forgot what they called it, but they get like, we are a pro-business town. You get a little plaque. And if you're a pro-business town, you get a better crack at the general fund than if you sort of have your NIMBY needs.
We created a program that was called Housing Choice, right? And it gave local communities the opportunity, if they were willing to do this, and this, we would certify them as a housing choice community, and then they would get first dibs on some of the stuff that we had available.
There was power of the purse.
Basic idea. Yeah. Sometimes it was also the power of, are you willing to move more quickly around how you make some of your decisions too? don't underestimate, time is money, right? Don't underestimate how important, creating incentives for folks to move more quickly,
Huge.
especially in housing.
We have more stories of CEOs fired, businesses left not because they were told no, but because yes stumbled along for so long and they had already raised capital commitments. And so they ended up going away. I love the time kills deals is a really important business lesson that states seem to need to learn. Why do you so I think of housing as one of these issues that should be a pro-market Republican-owned issue. And yet, all the way back to Lyndon Johnson and the Great Society with these horrible housing projects, it seems to be kind of the left seems to own housing as an issue, even though all the research on these housing projects shows they concentrate poverty, there's no power and autonomy in them. What do you think do you think there's a tide shift, or what is making that thinking still prevail as kind of good for housing, these housing projects and stuff?
I'm not up to date on how the federal government parses out its affordable subsidized housing money at this point. I would bet, I don't have any data in front of me to support this, but I would bet at this point the feds spend more money on scattered site stuff, vouchers, Section 8. And that was all about getting away from, the cluster that you're talking about. And I think for the most part, that's been their traditional policy now for a long time. I don't think when I think of housing, I think of most of the stuff that we worked on being some federal money, but more state, private, local on the stuff we were working on. And we did a ton of affordable housing stuff. And part of the affordable housing agenda that we created also included ownership opportunities. One of the things that historically has been true about housing is almost all the incentives in it are not about ownership. It's about rent. And so we created a bunch of programs that made it possible for people to own a house. And I think, you want neighborhood stabilization and things like that. You want to reduce some of the gentrification. You got to figure out a way to create more ownership opportunities for people.
Was there anything that happened along just actually, people say affordable housing, they usually mean government gave me some money, or government gave me a house, or government gave me a tax break, which led to money. Is there anything that states, governors can do on the actual practical, tactical cost per square foot of doing the construction in the first place? Reading a lot about new urbanism. Let's build a whole neighborhood at once, pour concrete once, put up sticks once, roofing once. Is there any of that that you think you've got hope for?
I think first of all, the build big idea, which you're talking about, the biggest challenge there is we're going to come back to the time question, right? People underestimate the price of time. If it takes you 3 years, 4 years, 5 years to just get to a point where you're mostly permitted, the time value of money and the amount of money you have to spend just to get there is ridiculous. And over that period of time, the cost of every single piece of what you're talking about goes up. And I think we've really underestimated the importance of time in this conversation.
Most of the importance of bureaucracy as the driver of time. The town permit, then the state permit, then the federal permit.
The rules and the requirements, everything else, which is not to say you shouldn't have any, but is to say there should be some window through which people need to make decisions. And that was one of the elements of that housing choice designation, was how quickly you could actually move, and how committed you were to actually being aggressive with your own permitting processes.
Yeah.
There was a point in time, and I don't know what the data would look like now, but there was a point in time when sort of greater Atlanta, and I'm going back to when I was governor, so this would have been maybe 4 or 5, 6 years ago. It might have been pre-pandemic. where Atlanta was building more housing in 6 months than Massachusetts was building in 2 years. I mean, there's real there's real money that's attached to that, and they were building really nice 3-bedroom homes on really nice lots for $350,000. I mean, it's not like it couldn't be done. It was being done.
I want to get to your third thing, was just the net coefficient of cost drag of living in Mass. I want to take just a minute on that one. We talked about the local relationship with towns and housing, which turn out to be closely bundled, right? But let's talk about this third one about cost of living. What does the state do about cost of living, other than obviously help the towns cut their property taxes, which seem to be going nuts?
I come back to, if you really want to get at the cost of, living in most states, you've got to take a run at the way your relationship with cities and towns is designated, designed, and works. And if you're not talking about that, you're missing out, because a huge piece of what people pay is going to be tied up in those things. I will say that from our point of view, there were some things you could do around electricity costs, which obviously, the grid has a lot to do with that. And one of the projects that I worked on a lot, which, honestly, I've kind of lost track of because it took so long and was tangled up for so long in the courts, which was a hydro project, which we tried to,
Quebec.
right, which we
You
worked
want to
on.
know who was behind? A little bird told me who was behind the movement to block that thing.
I think it was one of Hydro Quebec's competitors, wasn't it?
Yeah. It was, everyone thought it was an environmental. It was Seabrook.
But that was like 6 years, I mean, 6 years.
That
And
was so that was not Maine's finest hour either.
no, but the point here is that, most of the time, not all the time, but most of the time, the cost of living stuff is usually tangled up in time and process and the inability to actually do something. And that creates scarcity. In addition to the fact that you don't get whatever the new thing is, it means you don't have scarcity on the thing you were talking about. And when you have scarcity, you pay more for it. I mean, that's the way it works. And yeah, I had a lot. Look, governors, local officials, you are always going to have challenges with almost anything that looks like infrastructure, whether it's, housing, roads, public transportation, electricity, energy, whatever. But the bottom line is, if you can't get those things done in a reasonable time frame and in a reasonable way, it will create higher costs in just about everything else. It's just, I mean, it's not complicated math. It really isn't.
We haven't talked about taxes. If you look at the kind of rich state, poor state, Laffer Curve Institute or whatever, they say 5.5% is the cutoff. That if you are above that, you are probably entering a death spiral of one speed or another, depending on how. And if you are below that, you are probably stealing from other states and having a growth spiral. You held for almost all of your administration until a ballot initiative just below that line. You were on the rich state side of the line. How much of your life was just keeping taxes from exploding with everybody's ideas?
I think we did a good enough job of managing the budget generally. And, on that one, by the way, we had some pretty solid support in the legislature, which was, Democrat majority to do that. And there really wasn't a lot of, upward pressure around raising taxes. I think so this is a true story. I can't tell you how many times I met with company execs, especially from California, who were in either the life science space or the technology space, who were thinking seriously about, going somewhere else, opening up an operation somewhere else. And they would come to Massachusetts, they meet with me, and they talk to the locals and all the rest. And they would say three things. The first is, you have a 5% income tax rate. That's pretty good, especially compared to where we are now. The second thing is, you have good public schools. So we don't have to send our kids to private schools. I was surprised by how many people said, that they thought the public schools in Massachusetts were significantly better than the public schools in California. I don't know if that's still the case, but it certainly was at that point in time. And people talked about it a lot as a real benefit to being in and around here. And the third thing, and you'll love this one, was they said that the process of getting to and from work here was a lot easier than the process of getting to and from work in California. And, we talk a lot about how complicated our transportation and our infrastructure issues are. And they are complicated. But apparently, compared to what those guys were dealing with on the West Coast, not so much.
We're a taller midget.
Yeah, which is really interesting. Hey, works for me.
Yeah.
But the point is, if people don't believe that businesses make decisions about where to locate operations,
that's crazy.
Things like that, they're kidding themselves.
Right.
I mean, one final conversation: Amazon, right? The big conversation about
the headquarters battle.
Headquarters, right? And we were definitely in kind of like the final five. All right. And they came up and they visited us. They toured all over the place, and they basically said, your housing costs are already high, and we don't see anywhere near enough production coming to do anything about that. So we're probably going to go someplace else, even though we love a lot about who you are and what you're about. And, the first place they picked to go was New York City, right? So New York City was viewed as a better housing market, lower cost of living than we were for purposes of that, which is kind of amazing. And then New York basically said they didn't want them. And then they ended up in sort of that ring in Maryland and Virginia that runs outside the capital down there, which is probably one of the most expensive housing markets in the country. But they build new housing.
But they can build more. Yeah.
And they can build more. And I think, to me, that was a real lesson in you need to understand that, people don't just make the decision based on where they see you today. They make those decisions based on where they think you're going to be 5 years from now. Can you solve your problem? That matters to them. If you can't solve your problem, that matters to them too.
Right. It's two things. It's how you're doing today and how they think you'll do around the bend. Everything about our society is about what we think is about to happen. The stock market, unemployment, everybody's in spending, all about how they think things will be around the bend. Speaking of which, the last thing I want to cover is, there's a fair amount of housekeeping that goes on as a governor. And in your case, the housekeeping was unbelievable. Starting with what we thought would have been your big housekeeping challenge of those back-to-back snowstorms, and then ending with COVID, which was...
lucky guy, me, yeah.
Right, life being what happens when you're making other plans or whatever they say. You've got these 3 ideas that you worked on through your administration, but as a percentage of your time, I mean, how much of your time was tactical, practical, reactive stuff that needed to happen on your watch?
Probably half, maybe a little more, maybe more like 60, 65%. I mean, keep in mind that, government is a distributed decision-making model. So, whatever it is you're trying to do, even if it's what we would call something that's inside kind of the box of the day-to-day stuff, you still have to work it through the legislative process, and in many cases with a lot of the advocates who are interested in them and all the rest. I will say this, the lieutenant governor and I, almost everybody who, worked in the legislature was a city manager, a mayor, or a school committee chair, or, sort of an advocate. Almost all of them had our phone numbers. I mean, we took calls from just about everybody and anybody who wanted to talk to us. And she and I were both really wedded to this idea that if you truly want to know what's going on, you can't just rely, no offense meant to my awesome and wonderful staff, but you gotta give like the outside world a way in, and you can't make it. And by the way, the other thing that happens if your cabinet knows, and the people who work in the governor's office all know that if they don't return phone calls and they don't talk to people and they don't help them solve the problem, they can just call Karen or they can call Charlie. And that, the getting out of the office, the really being present in as many places as you possibly can be, and accepting that that's a big part of your job. Boy, did she and I pick up a ton of information about what was going on the ground in places all over Massachusetts, which then made it better and easier for us to figure out what the right decisions were to make with respect to how we spent our money,
Now, when you're doing those things and not building sort of 60 vote, call it, 60% on board fundamental changes, stuff flips when you leave. So in your looking back, is there anything you imagine doing different to inoculate the state against some of this sort of tragic backsliding that's gone on of late? How does a governor lock in value without, you don't want to be undemocratic, obviously, fight and die to protect the right of people to elect morons, but
I think the best thing you can do there is hope that things that you did would be viewed as worth keeping or building on. I do think to come back to the broadband in those communities in Western Mass. That changed everything for those people. We had a big gathering toward the end of our administration of folks from all those communities, and the stories they told about what a difference it made people cry. I think a lot of the work we did, we basically reconditioned all of the locomotives on the commuter rail, which were a nightmare. And the commuter rail, no one talks about it, but part of the reason no one talks about it is because commuter rails run really well for the better part of the past 10 years. The expansion of the commuter rail to New Bedford and Fall River, okay? No one really talks much about that. That thing had been on the agenda for 30 years, maybe more. And we got it done. It took longer than it should have. We got finished during the Healy administration, but so what? Parking lot is full every day down there. I talk to people who tell me that the real estate values are going up. Businesses are thinking about relocating there. In terms of like creating opportunity for people in lower cost areas, that whole thing was a home run. I guess what I would say, John, is there are certain things you can do that you believe have the capacity to stay. And then there's other stuff that a new administration and a new legislature are going to do what they think makes sense. And and you just have to be accepting of that. There's no magic answer, I don't think, to that one, other than if you do something that really works, it's likely in many cases that it will have advocates
people
who
will
will
keep
want
eating
to,
that dog food.
So
last question. You were, for most of your time, I believe, the single most popular governor in the United States out of 50 states. And if not, you were number 2 or 3, somewhere in there. And you were managing a legislature that was not your party. Did that mean the energy, the positivity about that felt in your constituency was really wonderful? In the course of delivering those results, did you have to not do some things? Did you basically say that's going to create, and in this era now of so much pleasure being taken at picking fights, did you see things that you wanted not to do and say, you know what, it's going to create so much dismay, rather take a step back and focus on things where people are more aligned? Did you take a pass on some fights in order to have the ability that you had?
Probably. Yeah, sure. But at the end of the day, I was pretty good at math, and counting votes is sort of a big part of how you actually get things done. And so what we did most of the time was, this is another part of the talking to people, right? Because the lieutenant governor and I were constantly talking to local officials and state legislators and others, we had a pretty good idea about what people cared about, and we could find champions for certain issues. There were Democrats or Republicans. There were city officials sometimes, state officials other times, and work with them to create the so-called coalition you needed to get something accomplished. And I will say this: we very rarely took credit for much of anything that we got done. That we use the word "we" a lot, and I think part of the rationale behind that was we wanted people to want to be successful in pursuing initiatives with us and to get the credit that they would feel that they deserved at the end. And the one thing I will say is, I think, for me anyway, given the, Republican registration in Massachusetts is very low. The biggest voting group, by the way, in Massachusetts by a mile are the independents. The independents really don't care about what color jersey you wear. What they care about is you actually get anything accomplished, and you get anything accomplished that they care about. And I think part of our success was not just not picking fights that weren't necessary. We picked fights if we thought we needed to pick a fight, but I wasn't going to pick a fight just to distract the media or the
name
public.
Of abstract conservatism.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, time, not enough hours in a day for that. But I think the big thing we did was we went looking most of the time for partners, people who would actually carry the water on something that mattered to them with us, and giving them the space and the opportunity to kind of lead the charge. And we had a lot of initiatives that were important to us that were carried in the legislature by Democrats because they were important to them. And I think one of the things people in politics sometimes think is that, especially if you're in the mayor's seat or the governor's seat, is you need to take credit for the thing all the way. It needs to be yours, right? Actually, no. If it actually happens, it's yours, irrespective of whether or not you were the biggest voice or the loudest voice articulating and arguing for something. And some of our biggest wins, were driven by people in the legislature who also wanted to make that happen. And we just let them lead because in the end, it was good for Massachusetts that it happened.
Well, also, it seems to me when you lead too strong, you don't build muscle fiber in other parts of your organization below. Right now, you've got two candidates in Massachusetts running for governor that were able to build enough muscle mass, who you let build enough muscle mass in your leadership approach that they were able to stand on their own, whereas a more me overarching may not, you may have had, nobody from that administration have enough clout or experience or power to make a run.
I think most of the people who work for us would say two things. Number one, they could get to us whenever they wanted to. And number two, if we told them to run on something that was challenging and risky and it didn't succeed, we were never going to hang them out to dry. And, we didn't do that. We just didn't.
Hopefully nobody does it to you. But life is long. Thank you very much, Charlie Baker, personal hero of mine, dear friend, great tactician, most popular governor in the United States of America during your time there, and president of the NCAA, where it's just a walk in the park.
Piece of cake every day.
For you, every day.
Yeah.
Thank you for joining us here on Maine for Keeps.
It's great to be with you, John. Absolutely great to be with you.
Thanks for tuning in to Maine for Keeps. I hope you enjoyed it. Be sure to follow us on social media, click and share with your friends, or get on to mainforkeeps.com. If you have ideas for new content or podcast guests, or if you'd like to give us some money to support the effort, be sure to click and send. We're at team@mainforkeeps.com, and I'm at jb@mainforkeeps.com. Thanks. See you soon.